Right, we should have some sound now. Yes, it is working. Sorry about that. So we're looking at Genesis chapter 37 and the story of Joseph. So let's read the first 17 verses of Genesis chapter 37. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colours. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered round it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I've dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asking him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word. We'll leave the story there. So, the favourite. I'm sure this is a story we all know very well. So we know what's going to happen in the story. So I don't need to worry about any spoiler alerts as we go through. I can make reference to things later on because we do know what is going to happen. But we're going to be looking at this, and this story of Joseph runs more or less from chapter 37 to chapter 50. And the story tells us how it was that Israel, the man, who's also called Jacob, and the people, Israel, would end up in Egypt. Back in Genesis 15, verses 13 to 14, we read, "Then the Lord said to Abram, 'Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions.'" He didn't actually mention Egypt, but this was the land that they were going to, but he did mention 400 years. And Israel were in Egypt for 400 years. But it also tells us how the promise God made to Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation would be fulfilled. Earlier in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 2, we read, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing.'" And as we read the book of Genesis, we can see how God's covenant promises are passed down from one generation to another, but not necessarily through the firstborn. Over and over again, God shows that his electing choice supersedes what would be the natural choice of men. And in this final section of Genesis, we see how God providentially orders all things to fulfill his purposes and his promises to his people, to give them descendants and land and nationhood and blessing, and also a spiritual stewardship. He does this by putting his people through a severe trial in the land of Egypt. So let's look now at Joseph. First of all, God's choice. We read at the beginning of our chapter, "Jacob lived in the land of his fathers, sojourning in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father." Do you remember that Jacob had 4 wives? He wanted to marry Rachel, and he was tricked into marrying her sister Leah because Leah was older, and her father felt that it was right that the oldest daughter should marry first. And so he married Leah and had to work 7 years before he could marry Rachel. But then Rachel didn't have any children, and Leah did, because God knew that Leah wasn't loved the same way as Rachel. And so Rachel then gave, following the traditions at the time, her maid to be another wife. And that was one of the concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah, that he had. And so that Rachel would then class any children that she had as hers. And Leah, not to be outdone, gave her maid. So Jacob ended up with 2 proper wives and 2 concubines or other wives. You could say he had 4 wives. And between them, they had, not counting Rachel, 10 boys and 1 girl. But then, finally, Rachel had 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. But Rachel was always the favourite. So it's just putting that into context. Jacob here lived in the land that his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham had sojourned in. It was their temporary home. The Bible uses the word sojourn. It doesn't mean lived. It's very temporary. He moved about a bit, but it was temporary. It wasn't permanent at this time. And these are the generations of Jacob. And the author, probably Moses, is keen to show us that it would be Joseph who would take over the mantle from his father. He is God's choice. He will be the successor to his father as the head of the family. Immediately after the title of the story, we're told that it is Joseph's life that will be key. We're told, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph. And he's the only one that's then named for quite a while. So he is going to be the important one in this account, going from Jacob. And there's usually a good reason why a younger son may take precedence. If you remember back, for Abraham, Ishmael was the firstborn, but he was not the son of the promise. He was not Sarah's son, real son. And he was the son of Sarah's maid. But it was Isaac who was the promised son, who would be the son of Abraham and Sarah, the younger one. For Isaac, he had twins, Esau and Jacob. Esau was the oldest, although we tend to say Jacob and Esau in that order, but Esau was the firstborn. And yet he despised his birthright and the blessing, and he went to live away from the land promised to Abraham and Isaac. He went to Edom. and Jacob trusted God. For Jacob, Reuben was the firstborn, but he incurred his father's wrath by sleeping with one of his concubines. And we read in Genesis 35, while Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. So he was no longer going to be number one son, although he was the oldest. And therefore, Joseph, the second youngest of 12 sons, became God's choice for leading the family. We'll see that later on, of course, in the story of David. David was the youngest son, number 8 of Jesse, and he was the one that God chose. Now, it was obvious to the whole family that Joseph was the favourite son. His mother had died when his only full brother Benjamin had been born. We're not exactly sure whether Benjamin is alive here, because Jacob does make reference to, will your mother and I bow down to you? It's possible that Benjamin was born a little later, but but it doesn't actually state that. But whatever, Joseph did know, because he found out that he did have a brother Benjamin. And that's when he was born. And because of that, Rachel had always been Jacob's favourite wife, and she was the one he wanted to marry but was cheated. And we're told in the passage that Joseph was 17 years old, and he was working with his brothers in the field. Some of his brothers, we're told they were the brothers of Bilhah and Zilpah, the two concubines. So not all his brothers. Benjamin wasn't there, and the sons of some of the sons of Leah were not there. But he was working in the field with his brothers. And verse 2 specifically tells us that he brought back a bad report to his father. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that Joseph would bring back a bad report of his brothers. Was he really a tattletale, whatever the expression is, tale-teller? But his brothers had already been involved in some significant mischief, you could say. Reuben sleeping with his father's concubine, Simeon and Levi slaughtering the Shechemites because of their sister's disgrace. And these men were rough. And if you want to know about those, just read previous chapters of Genesis. They were rough, they were hard, they were reckless. So he's not really a tale-teller. In fact, in verse 13, we read that Jacob sent Joseph out to check on his brothers. And this wasn't just about their welfare, but also whether they were treating the sheep well. It's thought that perhaps the first tale he brought back earlier was that the fact that the brothers were leaving the sheep, that they were going and getting drunk, or they were going to see girls or whatever, that they weren't actually looking after the sheep as they should. You know, fathers were at home, they're some distance away pasturing the sheep, and they weren't doing it necessarily properly. We don't know, we're not told, but that's the thought of what it was. And Joseph told his father the truth. But of course, the brothers didn't like it. And it put Joseph in a very difficult position now, because he's already the favourite son, his brothers don't like him, and now he functions as his father's informer. He's being asked to go and look up, see what his brothers are doing. In this first section, we see that God's choice isn't based on the value systems of men. God chooses wisely and rightly for his own purposes. And Joseph is God's man. Joseph is God's choice. And that is important. When God told Samuel that man looks on the outside, when Samuel was looking at Jesse's sons and thinking, wow, this one looks handsome, he's strong, he's physical, he'll be ideal as a king, as a leader. And God said, no, I look on the inside. So, favourite son. Well, we know the story, but let's just take a look at it briefly. In verses 3 and 4, we read, now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. So he and Benjamin were the last two to be born. And he made a robe of many colours. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. This was rather an extravagant gift from a doting father, which caused serious family strife. The text clearly states that Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. He didn't hide that fact. He gave him a multicoloured robe. Some versions of the Bible translated as a long-sleeved coat. Whatever it was, the Hebrew uses the same word in other parts of the Bible to describe royal robes. So it may have been multicoloured. It may have been just long-sleeved. And if you think of a long-sleeved robe, it's very difficult to work with something that has baggy sleeves and things like that. It wasn't something you wore when you were working and trying to do things. Again, an indication that perhaps Joseph wasn't going to be doing that sort of work. His brothers were shepherds, but it wasn't really suitable for being a shepherd in. We don't know, but all we know is that it caused him to stand out, and it was a visible representation of his father's preference of him over his brothers. And the result was predictable. The brothers hated him, and they wouldn't even speak peacefully to him. They were not on friendly terms with Joseph. We'll see this again later in the story. No spoiler worry, because you know it. There is family strife in the promised line, but God is going to use it for good. There's a purpose in it. And in the midst of this horrendous family situation, God has a plan at work. He was preparing a plan whereby he would redeem his people. God uses what he will for his own purposes, and he even employs trials with his people for those purposes. And all the pain experienced by Jacob and Joseph after him has a purpose. And we see it here in the providence of God. So that's something we can learn, that God is working. Things are going to happen to Joseph which are not very nice. No one would wish that on anyone, becoming a slave. But God has a plan. So thirdly, let's look at God's plans. Verses 5 to 11 relate to the two dreams that Joseph had, and rather naively told his family. Quite unselfconsciously, these dreams focus totally on Joseph, and he doesn't seem to have a clue how sharing them is going to impact his already alienated brothers. But it leads to further family division and even to a parental rebuke. What's interesting in these dreams is the first dream is a farming picture. This family are shepherds. They're not arable farmers. They don't go into the fields and harvest the corn. They look after sheep. Yet the brothers are all in the field harvesting the wheat. Does this foreshadow the future of Joseph, perhaps? Is God telling us something here that is not at present, but will be in the future? It will be through the harvest of grain that Joseph's name and fortune will be made in Egypt. We don't know, but it's an odd dream for shepherds. The second dream also brings out the expected response from his brothers, and this time even from his father. And despite the tactlessness and insensitivity of Joseph, the main thing we note is the reaction of the brothers to the dreams. And this is the reaction of the natural man to the doctrine and fact of election, of God's calling or choice. And in these dreams, God chooses Joseph. A natural man's instinctive response is to hate it, to resent it, to loathe God's sovereignty. Natural man questions God's purposes, his fairness and his justice. There is a difference in reaction between Joseph and his sons. And even though he rebukes Joseph, he hides, just like Mary did, this word in his heart. If you remember that when the shepherds came, that she remembered it and put it into her heart. And for he knows that this dream has come from God. He may not like the fact that his son has mentioned it like this and that he's going to be bowing down to his son, but he knows that it's come from God and there's great truth in it and he can't contest it. Now, it's important for us to recognize that God revealing his plans for Joseph in a dream is actually in order to emphasize that the life experiences that Joseph will undergo are not the product of chance. We need to know, and in fact the brothers need to know, that it is not chance. It's not luck or bad luck. We're told in advance that we will see that everything that happens to Joseph is the product of the will of God. And although Joseph will be the chief character in the passages to come, this story is more about God's sovereign election and choice than it is about Joseph. In these dreams, God reveals his plan, his providential plan for Joseph. And we will know that whatever happens in his life isn't part of a whim. It's not pure chance. This is the carrying out of the will of God. So let's have a look at Joseph's character. We learn a little bit here. We see more as we go through the story. But in verses 12 to 17, we get a little window into his character. Joseph tracks down his brothers in the fields of Dothan, and Joseph is revealed to us as a diligent, hard-working, obedient son, ready to do even unpleasant tasks. He's tasked by his father to find his brothers. Not something that most of us would want to do if we knew that our brothers hated us as much as Joseph hated us. As Joseph hated him, they did. They can't even speak to him on friendly terms. They resent him because of his dreams, which illustrate his superiority as chosen by God over them. But how does he respond to his father to the request to go? He says, verse 13, "Here I am." Meaning, right, okay, I'll go. It's not a task that he would have relished, yet he was hard-working. He was an obedient son. So off he goes. Verse 15 to 17 show Joseph walking in the fields where his brothers had been, in Shechem. Many of us may have thought, well, I've looked, they're not here, they've moved on somewhere, I've no idea where, they could be anywhere, I'll go home. And he might be thinking, yeah, that'd be a good thing to do, I don't have to then meet my brothers at this stage. But he didn't. He asks a man if he knows where they've gone. Unfortunately, that man had overheard them saying that they would move on to pastures in Dothan. He was undeterred at his task, and off he went. So in this account, we see that God's sovereignty and man's responsibility is a reality in the heart and the life of Joseph. God's choice of him doesn't lead him to indolence, to indifference, to passivity. He's working to do his father's bidding. He is faithful in the carrying out of his task, even though he knows that God has chosen him. So the doctrine of election doesn't lead him to no effort. It leads him to extraordinary effort. It doesn't lead him to a sense of entitlement. It empowers his ethic. And that's always how the biblical doctrine of election impacts the heart of a believer. In Dothan, as we know, Joseph will encounter his brothers, and it will be there that he'll be sold into slavery, in the one place near the grazing areas of his family that happened to be on the merchant route down into Egypt. Just happened to be there. Do you notice God's hand in the movement of his brothers and in the faithfulness of Joseph? This is a great story of God's providence. And as we begin to study this story, we can see God working in his mysterious ways. And as we sing that hymn about God's mysterious ways to perform, that we don't understand it. And it seems to be just pure chance. But no, the brothers moved from Shechem to Dothan, where they were right on the edge of the trading path down into Egypt, where, of course, some Ishmaelite slave traders will pass them, as we know later in the story. But we see God working, and we can see God working in our lives today and in things that happen, and we just have to trust God. We may not understand it, and Joseph certainly didn't understand what was going to happen to him, but he trusted God, and that's what we need to do, because we've seen in the Bible, throughout the Bible, how God prepares things. And we saw over Christmas reminding us that right from the beginning of Genesis through to Revelation, God's plan is there for the coming of Christ the first time and the coming the second time. So that's our first Bible study in the story of Joseph. We'll carry on next time.